The voicemail contained only 6 words. "Maya, don't trust your brother." She listened to it 3 times. Then she checked the number. It was hers. The message had somehow been sent from her own phone. Maya immediately went downstairs. Daniel was sitting in the kitchen, and before she could say anything, he asked, "Did you get the message?" At first, there was nothing unusual about the evening. She had finished what she needed to do, and as far as everyone around her knew, she was simply going about her plans. She sent a short message to someone close to her. Nothing dramatic, nothing that sounded like a goodbye. Just an ordinary message that, at the time, meant absolutely nothing. But later, that message would become one of the most important pieces of the entire story, because there was something she didn't mention, something she had apparently decided to keep to herself. And around the same time, another person received a message from her. This one was even stranger. It was completely harmless on the surface, but it contained a detail that didn't match what she had told anyone else. At first, nobody noticed. Why would they? People change plans. People give different explanations to different friends. And sometimes, people simply don't want to explain everything they're doing. So the evening continued, until one person tried calling her. No answer. They tried again. Still nothing. Then they noticed something unusual. Her phone wasn't turned off. It was still active, which meant she wasn't completely unreachable. Someone was simply not answering. And that raised a question nobody had an answer for. Why would she ignore everyone? Then, several hours later, a completely unrelated person came forward with a detail that changed the direction of the story. They claimed they had seen her earlier that evening, but according to their account, she wasn't alone, and the person standing beside her wasn't someone her family expected to see. The person who said they had seen her wasn't a close friend. In fact, they barely knew her. That's what made their story so interesting. They said they had noticed her earlier that evening, standing outside a small cafe near the edge of town. She wasn't eating. She wasn't waiting for anyone obvious. She was simply standing there, looking at her phone, and every few seconds she would look toward the parking lot, almost as if she were expecting someone. Then a car pulled in. She got inside. The witness couldn't identify the driver, but they remembered one thing clearly. She didn't look surprised to see them. She looked like she had been waiting. That immediately changed the family's understanding of the night, because everyone had assumed her plans were spontaneous. Now it seemed possible that she had arranged to meet someone beforehand. But there was another problem. When investigators checked the obvious places she might have gone, they couldn't find any trace of her. No useful message. No clear destination. Nothing that explained where she had gone after getting into that car. Then someone remembered the message she had sent earlier. They went back and looked at it again. And this time, they noticed something they had completely missed. She had chosen her words very carefully. She hadn't said where she was going. She hadn't said who she was meeting. And she hadn't given a time when she'd be back. It was almost as though she deliberately wanted the message to sound ordinary, while keeping the important part hidden. And that's when investigators began looking into something nobody had considered before, not where she had gone, not who had taken her, but what she had been trying to find out before she disappeared. Because according to someone who knew her well, she had been asking questions about something for several days, and whatever those questions were about, she had apparently been getting closer to an answer. For the next few days, she couldn't stop thinking about that evening. Not because she knew something terrible had happened, because one detail simply wouldn't make sense. Why had someone lied about seeing her? She went back through everything she could remember, the messages, the conversation outside the cafe, the car that had arrived, and then she remembered something she had almost forgotten. A few weeks earlier, she had found an old photograph while helping her family clean out a storage room. It was an ordinary photograph, except for one person standing in the background. She recognized him immediately. It was someone she hadn't seen since she was a child. At the time, she hadn't thought much about it, but now she remembered something else. That same person had been mentioned during the conversation that evening, not by name, just a small reference, a detail that would have meant nothing to anyone else, but she knew enough about her own past to realize it couldn't be a coincidence. So she started looking. Old messages, old photographs, a few conversations she had saved without knowing why, and eventually she found something that made her stop. There was a date connected to the person in the photograph, and according to what she had always been told, that person wasn't supposed to have been there. She checked the date again, then she checked the photograph, then the messages. They all pointed toward the same conclusion. Someone had been lying to her about what happened years ago, and suddenly, the strange events of the last few days didn't feel random anymore. They felt connected. She could have told someone. She could have walked away. Instead, she did something much riskier. She contacted the person from the photograph, and when they agreed to meet the following evening, she asked only one question. Why did you lie to me about that day? What she didn't know was that the person sitting across from her already knew exactly which day she meant. The next evening, she met him in a quiet coffee shop on the other side of town. For the first few minutes, everything felt almost normal. He asked how she had been. She asked about his life. Neither of them mentioned the photograph. Then she finally placed a copy of it on the table. She pointed to the person standing in the background. You told me you weren't there that day. He looked at the photograph, and for several seconds he said nothing. Then he gave her an explanation, a simple one. He said the photograph had been taken somewhere else, and that she must have remembered the date incorrectly. For a moment, she almost believed him, until she asked a second question. Then, how do you know what happened that afternoon? His expression changed, because she hadn't told him what she had discovered. She hadn't mentioned the old message. She hadn't mentioned the date, and she certainly hadn't told him what someone else had said about that day. Yet he immediately referred to a detail that only one other person should have known. That's when she realized something. She hadn't invited him there to find out whether he was lying. She had invited him there to see what he would reveal on his own, and he had just revealed something. But then he said something that completely changed her theory. He told her that he hadn't been the one who started the lie. He had been covering for someone else. She stared at him. Who? He hesitated. Then he gave her a name she recognized, but not for the reason he expected, because that person had already spoken to her earlier that week and had given her a completely different story. Now she had two people telling her two different versions of the same event, and for the first time, she understood something terrifying. Someone wasn't trying to hide what happened that day. They were trying to make sure she never discovered who else was involved. She left the coffee shop with more questions than answers. There was now a name she couldn't ignore. But before she confronted that person, she wanted to know whether the story she just heard was even possible. So she went back to the one place where she thought she might find something objective, the old family records. She wasn't looking for a confession. She was looking for a date. If the man's story was true, there should have been something that confirmed it. Instead, she found something that made the situation even stranger. An old document showed that the person she had just been talking about had been somewhere completely different on the day in question. At first, she thought that proved he was innocent. Then she noticed the date on the document. It was one day earlier than she remembered. She checked it again. Then she pulled out the old photograph. The photograph had been labeled with the original date. And suddenly, she noticed something in the background that she'd never paid attention to before. A sign. A business name. She searched for it. The business had closed years ago, but an old newspaper archive still had records of it. And one article contained a photograph. In that photograph was the same person she'd been investigating. But he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was the person who had originally told her the story she'd always believed. That was the missing connection. These two people had known each other long before she ever realized it. And now she understood why the story she'd been given never quite matched. But there was still one question she couldn't answer. Why would they both go to such lengths to hide something that happened years ago? Then she noticed something else in the old article. A short sentence near the bottom. Something that seemed completely unrelated to her investigation. It mentioned an event that had happened on the exact same day as the photograph, and that event explained why everyone had been so desperate to keep that day forgotten. Because the truth wasn't just about what happened back then, it was about what someone had done afterward. By now, she had enough pieces to understand the basic truth, but putting those pieces together was harder than she expected. Years earlier, something had happened that could have exposed several people. Instead of telling the truth, they had agreed on a different version of events, and for years, that version had remained untouched. Until she started asking questions. The photograph was real, the date was real, and the connection between those two people was real. But there was one part of the story that still didn't fit. Why had they been so afraid of her finding out? She went back through the old records one more time. That's when she found the detail that finally connected everything. The person she had always trusted to explain that period of her life had actually known about the incident from the beginning. Not only that, they had been the person who originally convinced everyone to keep quiet. The reason wasn't what she expected. There had been an accident that day. Something happened that nobody had intended. And afterward, the people involved panicked. They were afraid of what would happen if the truth came out. So they made a decision. They would tell everyone a simpler story, a story that left out the most important part. For years, it worked, until she found the photograph, until she noticed the date, until she started asking questions. And now she finally understood why someone had been trying so hard to keep her away from the truth. But there was still one thing bothering her. If the story had been hidden for so many years, why had someone suddenly started lying again now? That question would lead to the final piece of evidence. And when she found it, she realized the truth she had uncovered wasn't the whole story. It was only the part someone wanted her to find. She thought she had finally figured it out. The accident, the photograph, the lie, the people who had agreed to keep the truth hidden. Everything seemed to fit. But then she went back to the very first thing that had started her investigation, the message she received that evening. She read it again, and this time, she noticed something she'd completely overlooked. The message had been sent from a number she recognized, not the person she'd been investigating, not the person she'd confronted. It belonged to someone else, someone who had never been mentioned in the investigation. She searched through her old contacts. Then she found the name. Her own family had saved the number years ago, and suddenly, the old photograph made sense. The person standing in the background wasn't there by accident. They weren't simply connected to the people who had lied. They had been watching what happened. But the biggest revelation came next. The original story she'd been told wasn't created to hide an accident from her. It had been created to hide who had actually been responsible for the situation that caused the accident. And the person who had been feeding her pieces of the truth wasn't trying to help her uncover everything. They had deliberately allowed her to discover just enough to blame the wrong person. Why? Because there was one final secret they needed to protect. They weren't an innocent witness. They were the person who had been there from the beginning. And suddenly, the strange message from that evening wasn't mysterious anymore. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a test. Someone had been waiting to see whether she would finally start asking questions. And the moment she did, they knew she was getting dangerously close to the truth. For years, she had believed the story she was given. She believed the people involved had simply made a terrible mistake and then tried to protect themselves from the consequences. But now she understood something much more disturbing. The lie had never really been about the past. It had been about protecting someone in the present. She confronted the person whose number had appeared in that old message. At first, they denied everything. Then she showed them the photograph, the old records, and finally, the message. There was nowhere left to hide. They admitted they had known about the incident for years. They admitted they had helped maintain the false story. But then came the part she never expected. They hadn't been afraid of her discovering what happened. They had been afraid she would discover why it happened. The original incident had been covered up because revealing the truth would have destroyed more than one person's life. Families would have fallen apart. People would have lost everything they had built. So everyone involved chose silence. And eventually, the lie became easier to live with than the truth. But there was one thing they hadn't anticipated. She would eventually find the photograph. And once she did, the story they'd carefully constructed for years began falling apart, piece by piece. The strangest part? The person she had suspected first wasn't the mastermind. The person she had confronted wasn't either. The person who had been quietly controlling the story was someone she had trusted all along. After everything came out, there was no dramatic confrontation, no movie-style ending, just consequences. Relationships changed. People who had spent years protecting the secret finally had to live with what they had done, and she was left with something far more difficult than an answer. She had to accept that some of the people who had told her they were protecting her had actually been protecting themselves. She still kept the photograph, not because she wanted to remember the lie, but because it reminded her of something she would never forget. Sometimes the most dangerous secrets aren't the ones people hide from you. They're the ones everyone agrees to pretend never happened.